Many Muslims worry that the smallest mistake might break their fast. People ask questions like, did swallowing saliva break my fast? What if I accidentally ate something? What about brushing my teeth? Because of these doubts, some people spend the entirety of their Ramadan constantly worrying that their fast might already be invalid. But Islam actually gives very clear principles about what breaks the fast and what doesn't. So in this video, I'll go through the actions that actually invalidate the fast, and also the things that many Muslims worry about that do not break the fast at all. Right, so when we talk about fasting in Islam, what do we actually mean? At its core, fasting means that a Muslim intentionally refrains from certain things, from dawn until sunset. So it's not just about being hungry or thirsty, it's an act of worship, done consciously in obedience to Allah. But this is where a lot of confusion starts. Many Muslims end up worrying about small, natural things that happen to the body during the day, things that aren't really under a person's control. And because of that, people can become anxious about whether their fast is still valid over matters that Islamic law does not actually treat as invalidators. And this is an important principle to understand. Islamic law distinguishes between intentional acts and unavoidable bodily processes. In other words, there's a difference between something a person deliberately does and something that simply happens naturally. So the real question is not, does every little thing break the fast? The real question is, what actions truly invalidate the fast? And that's the question we need to answer clearly, carefully, and according to the principles of the religion. Okay, the core principle that scholars explain is this. The fast is broken when a person intentionally performs an act that contradicts the purpose of fasting. Now, that usually means actions like deliberately eating or drinking during the fasting hours. But Islam also recognizes the difference between intentional acts and normal bodily processes. Once again, right? Understanding this principle removes a lot of unnecessary confusion. So what then are the main things that actually invalidate the fast? At the most basic level, there are a few clear actions that do break the fast if a person does them intentionally during the fasting hours. The first is intentional eating, obviously. If someone knowingly eats while fasting, then the fast is broken, because one of the very essences of fasting is to withhold oneself from food for the sake of Allah. The second is intentional drinking. And the same principle applies here. If a person deliberately drinks during the day in Ramadan or during any obligatory fast, then that directly goes against what fasting is meant to involve. Third is marital relations during fasting hours, right? This also invalidates the fast because fasting is not only about leaving food and drink, but about disciplining one's desires and restraining oneself during the day. And really, all of these have something in common. They clearly contradict the discipline that fasting requires. Fasting is an act of self-restraint. It is a deliberate holding back from certain lawful pleasures during a set time in obedience to Allah. So when a person intentionally does one of these acts, they have gone against the basic meaning of the fast itself. And that's why these are treated as clear invalidators. The matter is simple. When a person deliberately eats, drinks, or engages in marital relations during fasting hours, the fast is no longer intact. But here's where some people get confused, right? A lot of Muslims worry about things that don't actually break the fast at all. And this confusion often makes fasting feel much more stressful than it needs to be. And this is where scholarly clarification becomes really helpful, because once we understand the basic principles of fasting, a lot of the common confusions start to clear up. Take swallowing saliva, for example, which I've been doing during this whole recording, because I'm recording this video during the day in Ramadan, right? This does not invalidate the fast because saliva is something natural and unavoidable. A person cannot realistically live the entire day without saliva being present in the mouth, and swallowing it is part of the body's normal function. So this is not treated like eating or drinking. Then there's accidental eating or drinking. If someone genuinely forgets that they're fasting and eats or drinks unintentionally, that does not invalidate the fast. Why? Because the act was not deliberate. And as we said earlier, Islamic law distinguishes between what a person intentionally does and what happens without intention. Another issue people ask about is brushing the teeth. Scholars discuss this carefully, not because brushing itself is automatically an invalidator, but because they look at whether anything is actually entering the body in a deliberate way. So the ruling is approached through the same logic. What exactly happened? Was it intentional? Does it resemble eating or drinking in any meaningful sense? The same applies in medical situations. Scholars examine these cases by returning to the core principles. They ask, is this nourishing in the way food and drink are? Is something entering the body intentionally? Is it unavoidable? Is it done out of necessity? In other words, they don't issue rulings randomly or as a blanket statement. They assess each case through a coherent framework. And this is actually something very beautiful about Islamic law. These rulings are not just a scattered list of do's and don'ts. They are derived logically by applying consistent principles to real situations. So once you understand the foundations, many of these detailed rulings begin to make perfect sense. Now this brings us to something deeper. What is the wisdom behind fasting in the first place? Fasting is not meant to be like a dry legal exercise, and it's not meant to turn a believer into someone who's constantly nervous, suspicious, and afraid over every tiny bodily occurrence. The whole purpose of fasting is much greater than that. Fasting is about self-discipline. It trains a person to restrain the self, to resist urges, and to act out of obedience to Allah rather than impulse. When a person leaves food, drink, and other desires for the sake of Allah, they are learning mastery over themselves. But fasting is also about awareness of God. It develops taqwa. A person may be alone, with no one else around, fully able to eat or drink in secret. Yet they refrain because they know Allah sees them. So the fast is not only about what the body avoids, it's about what the heart learns. It teaches sincerity, vigilance, and consciousness of one's Lord. And that's exactly why we should avoid unnecessary anxiety about small details. Yes, the rulings matter. Yes, we want to worship correctly. But the goal of fasting is spiritual discipline, not constant fear over minor matters that are natural, accidental, or unavoidable. So a Muslim should approach fasting with seriousness, but also with clarity and balance. Yeah, we're meant to guard the fast, not to be consumed by paranoia over it, right? The point is to grow in obedience, self-control, and closeness to Allah, not to spend the entire day trapped in doubt over every little thing. So what should a Muslim actually do with all this in practical terms? First, learn the core principles of fasting. Don't build your understanding of worship on panic, hearsay, or random things people say online, right? Learn what fasting actually is, what clearly invalidates it, and how scholars reason about the detailed cases. Once you understand the foundations, a lot of confusion just falls away. Okay, second, don't overthink natural bodily processes. Not every small thing that happens in the body is an invalidator of the fast. Saliva, forgetfulness, and other unavoidable matters are not the same. They're not the same as deliberately eating and drinking. So a person shouldn't turn fasting into a state of constant suspicion. Focus on intentional discipline. This is where the heart of fasting really lies. Guard your actions knowingly, right? Guard your tongue, your desires, and your conduct. Be conscious of what you are doing, deliberately, for the sake of Allah. The believer should aim for clarity rather than doubt. Islam doesn't call us to live in obsessive uncertainty. It calls us to worship with understanding. So learn the principles, act with sincerity, and don't overburden yourself with confusion over things that are natural or unavoidable. That is the balanced path. Seriousness in worship, but not anxiety. Discipline, but not paranoia. Clarity rather than doubt. Right? The key thing to remember is that fasting is about intentional discipline, not accidental mistakes or natural bodily processes. When Muslims understand the principles behind fasting, Ramadan becomes a time of focus and spiritual growth rather than confusion. Now, if you found this explanation helpful, consider subscribing. On this channel, I try to provide clear, structured answers to common questions about practicing Islam, so you can approach your worship with confidence and understanding.